Well, hello everyone, Spencer here for another episode of Painting of the Week. And this week we're actually going to be embarking on my first formal architecture video, so hopefully this is at least relatively well received. And I think what I want to do is devote the entire month of October to talking about this term Gothic, what it means in terms of art, painting, what it means in terms of architecture. This week we're going to be talking more just about the basics of Gothic architecture, how to develop this sort of vocabulary to be able to speak in an educated manner about Gothic buildings. So we'll begin with a little bit of history. The Gothic architectural style is a medieval style of architecture, and it developed from the Romanesque style, so we see an example of Romanesque architecture here. And the term originally had a negative connotation, and it originated from the Goths, which were a Germanic tribe that was considered barbaric by the distinguished Romans. So the reason that this architectural style came to be linked with these, barbarians, is that the Gothic architecture departed in pretty dramatic fashion from the classical Greek and Roman architectural styles that were considered more formal. So what I want to do here is sort of talk about Gothic architecture in the context of three recurring themes that we see here. One of them is verticality, and related to verticality is this idea of height. So Gothic cathedrals and buildings tend to be very tall. A lot of times these old cathedrals in Europe are, by far the tallest and largest buildings in the entire city. So this is a good example maybe to talk about some of the terminology here. These are called parapets, and we have a better example, I think, actually right here. Okay, so each one of these little towers is called a parapet. And we'll talk a little bit later about how the religious significance of verticality and of height is to suggest that these buildings are reaching towards the heavens. And since the majority of what we usually think of when we think of a Gothic architecture is these big cathedrals that were built in medieval Europe, that's sort of an appropriate motif, this idea of reaching up toward the sky. And then the last thing that we're going to kind of brush on is light. So light was very important in Gothic architecture. These buildings are fairly dark on the inside. They're made of stone, and of course the light bulb wasn't something that was invented yet. So one of the challenges in designing these cathedrals and these Gothic buildings was how to best use ambient light to try to light the building. Okay? So the first thing, and this is kind of maybe the cornerstone, I would say, of Gothic architecture, is the pointed arch, or this is sometimes called the ogival arch. And it's actually a structural element that was borrowed from Islamic architecture. And like I said, these recurring themes, verticality, is definitely something that we see here in the pointed arch. So this is quite a bit different from the rounded arches that were typically associated with Romanesque architecture and also classical architecture. This idea of sort of reaching forward or upward gives this sense of verticality to the pointed arch. And this was used for windows and also for the arcades within the naves of the cathedrals. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But they oftentimes contain some sort of a geometric motif in the top here. Okay, so this is similar to a trefoil, except a trefoil would have three leaves, so I'm not exactly sure what this would be called. But some of these geometric motifs that we see in the points of the arches are quite intricate, quite complex. So this is an example of what we call flamboyant Gothic architecture. You can see that the geometric design here, the tracery, is quite elaborate, hence the name flamboyant. Okay? So the pointed arch. And another thing that we want to talk about is the ribbed vaulting that we usually see in the ceilings of Gothic buildings. So I'm not going to get into the engineering of it, but basically the ribbed vault was a structural development that allowed architects to design these buildings to be much taller than had previously been possible. And once again, that recurring theme of height and of verticality shows up here. And these are able to hold, obviously, a tremendous amount of weight, and we'll talk a little bit more about how they do that later on when we talk about buttressing. But that's due to the steep angle of the vaults. And they also tend to be kind of narrow. So, for instance, we're standing here in the nave of a cathedral, and the nave is sort of the long central hallway that you think of when you think of a cathedral. And these naves are usually much longer than they are wide, which, once again, contributes to the sort of vertical appearance of this building. Kind of like when we say sometimes when a person is really skinny, it almost makes them look taller than they really are. So this narrow design of the nave was also useful for constructing these cathedrals in the characteristic cruciform style of cathedrals, and I'm going to draw one out right now. So this is the nave, okay, so the altar goes up here, And then we have what's called a transept that goes across the front of the nave like this to create this cruciform design for the cathedral. And of course, you can see it looks like a cross. So not only was it architecturally simple and attractive, but it also, you know, had religious significance attached to it. More examples of ribbed vaulting that you can see here. Pretty much walk in any Gothic building and look up at the ceiling and you'll probably see this, okay? And you can see that the idea of the pointed arch is also reflected. Like I said, it's used for windows, but that's a motif that's really repeated in Gothic architecture in general, and we see it also in the vaulting as well, this idea of the pointed arch. Okay, this reaching upward, like that. Alright, so here I am standing with my sister outside of the Notre Dame Cathedral, right here. And of course we're going to talk about flying buttresses. So, as you can probably imagine, the stone that was used to construct these cathedrals was very heavy, and that exerted a very significant amount of force. Particularly the stone that was used to construct the roof would exert a lateral force on the walls of the cathedral, like this. And you might have to zoom in here to full screen to be able to see what I'm drawing, because I don't think I can adjust the thickness of these lines. But that would exert a very significant force on the walls of the cathedral, and if there was no way of constraining that force, the walls had a tendency to explode outward. So the sort of traditional remedy for that was to use a buttress. Let me try to draw a straighter line here. Okay, so here's our cross-section kind of the cathedral. And what they would do to prevent that wall from exploding outward is they would create sort of like a second wall, like this, which would absorb some of that lateral force here and prevent that wall from expanding outward. Now, the flying buttress is unique in that it actually doesn't extend alongside the side of the building like this. So what we have here are these vertical pillars, like what we see right here and right here, and these are the actual buttresses. But what we really think of when we think of the flying buttress is the flyer, which extends along the side like so, okay? So these flyers carry that lateral force that's being exerted by the heavy amount of stone here on the ceiling is pushing these walls outward like this, okay, along the flyer, and then the vertical pillar transfers that lateral force down into the ground. Now there's a few advantages of this. One is that the design is actually quite a bit cheaper and lighter than the traditional buttress, and it also takes up much less space. So in our traditional buttress that we have over here, okay, as you can see, since this traditional buttress occupied all of this space against the wall, there was no way to put a window right here because that window would just be looking into the buttress. So the flying buttress was a way to essentially be able to create more space along the walls of the cathedrals, which meant that additional windows could be put in, and that would increase the amount of light that was brought into the cathedral. Oh, okay, so this is actually a great example. So what we're doing is we're just looking at a row of flyers here. So here's the weight, or here's the wall rather, and the amount of force that's being pushed against that wall by the heavy stone on the roof is being carried outward by this buttress. And then here's the vertical tower over here, and that force is being carried directly into the ground, and it prevents the wall from exploding outward. Okay, more flying buttresses. Once again, sort of something that is very commonly associated with Gothic buildings. Okay, let's talk about light now. So as I said, the flying buttresses, the reason that they were so great is because they allowed for these very large windows to be put into the walls of these cathedrals, and the ribbed vaulting also contributed to these big windows, okay, so the ceiling and the walls were actually able to support a window of this size. A lot of times these windows, they were used as a means to convey the stories in the Bible to a population that was going to be predominantly illiterate. So this is sometimes called like the poor man's Bible. So these people who would attend church, they couldn't read the Bible on their own, but they would learn the stories by these windows. So I think this is a window in the St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague. So I want to spend a little time now talking about the different levels of windows that we see in Gothic buildings. So this is a more modern building, obviously, but still built in the Gothic style, so it's using brick. But you can see the pointed arch windows here, and it's got some buttresses. But first of all, the main level that we think of in a church is the nave. So the nave runs along below this line right here. And this is kind of the main level of the church. So the pews, where you sit, would be located down here. This is sort of the bottom floor down here. This level of windows that we see up here, kind of between these two red lines here, is what's called the clerestory. And the clerestory is basically just an additional level of windows toward the ceiling of the church. So this is, again, the idea here is to let as much light in as possible into the building. Now this area in here between the clerestory and the nave is called the triforium. And the triforium is, sometimes it's actually like an actual narrow passageway that's within the inner wall and above the nave. So a lot of times it was located over a sloped ceiling like this, which gave the actual triforium, if it actually was like a real hallway, this triangular shape. And we see a good example of that here. So here are the pointed arches of the nave. We see the clerestory windows up here, okay, which provide the interior of the cathedral with additional light, and then these pointed arches within here create the triforium. Okay, let's talk about the facade now. So the facade of these cathedrals, obviously very ornate, usually big doors which are capped with a tympanum, which we see right here. And for those of you who watch my Latin videos, right, tympanum is Latin for drum. So here's a better view. So this is the tympanum here. It includes this arch that we see up along the top here, and it's capped along the bottom by a lintel. And these usually contain these pretty elaborate sculptures like this. A lot of times it's the depiction of the dies irae, right, the day of wrath, the judgment day. And then usually directly above these are the rose window. So here's another example of a tympanum. So this one is painted. And even the ones that we see today in the big medieval cathedrals in Europe, a lot of times these aren't painted, but they probably were painted back when the cathedral was first built. So there's been some efforts to try to restore them in some cathedrals. I think this one is in Switzerland, in Bern. And then I mentioned the rose window that's usually directly above the tympanum. The only types of cathedrals that usually don't have rose windows are the English cathedrals. So this gives me a good opportunity to talk about Gothic architecture. Is a sort of a universal style, but it was also localized. And each one of these regional styles had its own characteristics that make it unique. And we'll talk a little bit more about at least English Gothic architecture when I talk about the University of Michigan Law School in a week or two. But just to give you some examples, this is French Gothic here. Okay, this is English Gothic. And then this is an example of Italian Gothic. The last thing I want to talk about here is Neo-Gothic architecture. So this can be a little bit confusing. This is the Basilica de Volta Nacional in Quito, in Ecuador, okay, where I spent some time. And even though this might look like a Gothic cathedral that you would see in Europe, this is actually built in the 19th century. Okay, so this is what we call Neo-Gothic architecture, or Gothic Revival architecture. And maybe this is obvious to most of you, but it's architecture that was built in the Gothic style, but not in the actual appropriate time period of Gothic architecture. So it's sort of anachronistic, even though it attempts to imitate a building that was built in the Middle Ages in the Gothic style. And we have some examples of Neo-Gothic architecture in the United States, too. Probably the clearest example of that would be the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., okay, is Neo-Gothic. Specifically, this is kind of English Neo-Gothic. So if we look back at, so this was French, this is English. So look at the towers here. And then you can see that kind of reflected in the towers that we see here in the National Cathedral as well. Okay, so Gothic Revival. And even the Houses of Parliament in London are also Gothic Revival, okay, built in the Gothic style, the English Gothic style, of course. And then even sometimes like this, so this is the University of Pittsburgh. I think this building is actually called the Cathedral, and it's Gothic, and you don't usually think of skyscrapers as being Gothic, but if you look on the inside of this, it maybe, it looks much more like a traditional Gothic building. You can see the pointed arches here as well. I think a lot of times people really tend to be drawn toward Gothic architecture because of the ornate detail. And the real takeaway message here is that detail and the design elements of Gothic architecture were meant to be seen as a testament to the glory and the majesty of God.